And we are live. Welcome back, everyone, to Grockit's OGTV, or welcome the first time if this is your first time listening to the broadcast. This is the GMAT edition of the test, or the GMAT, that didn't make sense. This is the GMAT edition of the broadcast, where we go through the official guide to the test made by the makers of the test, hence the name, the official guide. We're using the 12th edition, and you do need to have a copy of the book in front of you, because I will not be printing the entire question on the screen for you. So like I said, 12th edition to the guide. This is the main book, not either of the supplements. And we will be going through the entire thing, question by question, from one cover to the other, until we get to the end. Right now, we're in the critical reasoning section, and we are about a third of the way through. There's 124 critical reasoning questions in the book. We left off last time. We finished up with question number 43 on page 498, and so we're going to pick up with question number 44 on page 398. Did I mention my name is Jim Jacobson? My name is Jim Jacobson. It says that on the screen, but I guess you wouldn't have necessarily believed that unless I said it. Let's get started. So page 498 and question number 44. Okay, so TranCorp currently transports all its goods to Burland Island by truck. The only bridge over the channel separating Burland from the mainland is congested, and trucks typically spend hours in traffic. Trains can reach the channel more quickly than trucks, and freight cars can be transported to Burland by barges that typically cross the channel in an hour. Therefore, to reduce shipping time, TranCorp plans to switch to trains and barges to transport goods to Burland. Which of the following would be most important to know in determining whether TranCorp's plan, if implemented, is likely to achieve its goal? And so with questions like this, the which of the following is when you get a question like this, it says which of the following would be useful to determine whether the thing is going to meet its goal. Step one, you need to paraphrase as briefly as possible what that goal actually is. In this particular case, their goal is to get their goods to Burland Island faster. Okay, so that part's easy, so all of the correct answer choices, any correct answer choice would deal with things that would affect the speed with which their goods get to Burland Island. The other thing you need to do is just kind of phrase in your mind what could weaken their plan, because very often that's what the question is going to be, whether this weakening factor exists or not. And so really, because their goal is to get the goods there faster, something that would weaken it might cause their goods to arrive more slowly. We don't even have to look at the answer choices to determine this much, okay? Because the goal depends entirely on speed, or on time, if you will. We need to know whether there's some other factor that might not make it as time efficient as possible. So we look for that in the answer choices. Choice A, whether transportation by train and barge would be substantially less expensive than transportation by truck. If you've been following these broadcasts, you've heard me mention, I think every time now, so this shows how often this comes up, that time and money are common wrong answer choices when the argument does not hinge on those things. Now in this case, the argument does hinge on time, so the correct answer will actually involve time, but this is the example of the money trap in answer choice A. I'm using the $ because that is my native currency, but you could substitute your own symbol in your notes if you want. Anyway, B, whether there are boats that can make the trip between the mainland and Burland faster than barges can. So this is one of these false distinctions that doesn't really matter for the original argument. The argument is about whether train plus barge is faster than truck. We don't have to worry about whether there's boats faster than barges. That's outside the scope of the argument, and it's an unneeded distinction between the elements that we have so far. So it's not choice A, it's not choice B. Choice C, whether loading the freight cars onto barges is very time consuming. Hey, well, remember how I said that the correct answer would relate to time, and that we would need to know whether there's any factors that would make things take longer. Remember, that was my prediction. Sure enough, there it is, answer choice C. if barges take, if loading freight cars onto barges takes a long time, this plan may not be as amazing. So even though the transport time, trains get to the water faster than trucks, barges get over the water faster than trucks, but if it takes a really long time to load, it may not be a time savings after all. So choice C is looking great, but let's, again, this whole time and money thing is one of the classic reasons why it's useful to look at wrong answer choices when you're doing untimed practice. You really get good at recognizing how they make these things. Choice D, whether the average number of vehicles traveling over the bridge into Berlin has been relatively constant in recent years. Nobody cares. So that one is totally outside the scope. It's really just whether barges and trains are faster. Choice E, whether most trucks transporting goods into Berlin return to the mainland empty. So that is an interesting question, and this is one of those ones that I think is meant to attract, your business mind. All of you are studying for this test, presumably because you want to go into an MBA program and do more kind of business management, higher level decision making. Something like that, trucks coming back empty when that might not be a best use of resources, that would be a really important question to ask in the real world. The GMAT is not in the real world, or at least the world of its questions is not the real world. It's a very limited kind of logical subworld. And so choice E, whether the trucks are coming back empty is irrelevant. It's all about the speed with which they are crossing over to Berlin, getting the goods there to begin with. The return trip, not in the scope of the passage. So that leaves us with only choice C for question number 44. Okay, so we are on page 498 and crossing over to 499. And this is question number 45. Some anthropologists study modern-day societies of foragers in an effort to learn about our ancient ancestors who were also foragers. A flaw in this strategy is that forager societies are extremely varied. Indeed, any forager society with which anthropologists are familiar has had considerable contact with modern non-forager societies. Which of the following, if true, would most weaken the criticism made above of the anthropologist's strategy? And so again, whenever they don't summarize for you what the goal or strategy or argument is, you want to paraphrase it first. The strategy is to look at modern, the anthropologist strategy is to look at modern forager societies to learn things about ancient forager societies. The criticism, so they want to look at the modern ones, learn about the ancient ones. The criticism is that modern forager societies are varied and they all have contact with modern societies. So, and this question is asking us to weaken the criticism of the anthropologist's strategy. So with questions like this, where they ask you to weaken a criticism, these can be kind of interesting because you need to look at both what the criticism is and what the argument is. Sometimes weakening the criticism is strengthening the argument. Sometimes weakening the criticism is just weakening the logic of the criticism without strengthening the argument, if that makes sense. So in this case, if we were to strengthen the argument, the first one here, we would want to highlight the connections between ancient and modern forager societies. If we were to weaken the criticism, we would want to perhaps say that contact with modern societies doesn't impact some elements of forager societies, or that in spite of contact with the modern, there's still stuff to learn, or that despite being varied, maybe they have some things in common. Okay, so you just weaken you weaken the individual elements of the criticism or strengthen the connection in the strategy. So we need something like that in the answer choices. There's more things that we might be looking for in the answer choices, but it should still jump out at us. Let's take a look. Choice A, all forager societies throughout history have had a number of important features in common that are absent from other types of societies. Okay, so that actually does a little bit of both. So if all forager societies through all time have had some common factors, that definitely links the modern and the ancient. It also weakens the point of the criticism that said that these forager societies are varied. They may well be varied, but if they have certain common elements, and those things have been true for all foragers for all time, looking at them would still be relevant. So, you know, my prediction about it doing one or the other didn't turn out to be true, but the thought that went into making this type of prediction still bore fruit. And so, again, predicting what sorts of things you're looking for in the answer choices with critical reasoning, you can't always do it, especially with inference questions, but doing it saves you a lot of time. Choice A jumps out at us as the correct answer. Let's look at the other ones, though. Choice B, most ancient forager societies either dissolved or made a transition to another way of life. Yeah, you know, what they did isn't really what the argument is about. The argument is about looking at the modern to figure out stuff about the ancient. Whether they dissolved or made a transition to another way of life isn't necessarily relevant. We're not saying that the modern forager societies are a continuation, like that that some ancient foraging society went on continuously from the ancient era all the way to the modern. That may be true. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist. I don't actually know. But choice B is suggesting that maybe that's what anthropologists think, but that's not what the argument is about, so it's not B. C, all anthropologists study one kind or another of modern-day society. I don't think that's true either, actually. You know, there are paleoanthropologists. D, many anthropologists who study modern-day forager societies do not draw inferences about ancient societies on the basis of their studies. Probably true, but it doesn't do anything about the criticism of those who do make those types of inferences. And then choice E, even those modern-day forager societies that have not had significant contact with modern societies are importantly different from ancient forager societies. So this actually strengthens the criticism. So this basically says that they are super varied, even when they don't have much contact with the modern, basically dissociating them further from the ancient connection. So this would have strengthened the criticism. So if you misunderstood what you were supposed to do in this question, you might have chosen choice E because it's constructed the way it should be to strengthen it. Anyway, that's not what we needed to do, though. We needed to weaken the criticism, so choice A is the correct answer. On to page 499 and question number 46. Contrary to earlier predictions, demand for sugarcane has not increased in recent years. Yet, even though prices and production amounts have also been stable during the last 3 years, sugarcane growers last year increased their profits by more than 10% over the previous year's level. Any of the following statements, if true about last year, helps to explain the rise in profits except. So the argument here is that prices have stayed stable. We have demand has also stayed stable. That's what it says, right? It says, it says prices and production, actually. I should get rid of this because actually demand is not part of profit anyway. But somehow still profits went up. So again, without looking at the answer choices, if the amount you're getting for your product remains stable and the amount that you're producing remains stable and your profits went up, again, if you're collecting the same amount of money and your production is the same, basically the only way that profits could go up is if costs are going down. The cost to produce those elements that you're producing, if you're collecting the same price, for profits to go up, what you're putting into it needs to decrease. So, in theory anyway, every wrong answer choice should feature a way that costs are going down. So choice A, many countries that are large consumers of sugarcane increase their production of sugarcane-based ethanol, yet their overall consumption of sugarcane decreased. Okay, so what this is saying is that countries that have a high demand for sugarcane are using more of it for ethanol and are using less of it for themselves. That doesn't really address the issue of costs, so let's just kind of keep that one and just see what the other answer choices look like. Choice B, sugarcane growers have saved money on wages by switching from paying laborers an hourly wage to paying them by the amount harvested. So saved money on wages, that sounds like a cost decrease. So that makes it a wrong answer. That would explain why profits went up. Choice C, the price of oil, the major energy source used by sugarcane growers in harvesting their crops, dropped by over 20%. So the cost to fuel the machines that they use to harvest stuff, cost of fuel went down. I don't know why I put an S there. I was thinking about the S in cost, I guess. That's another one where cost went down. Therefore, that's not the right answer. That would explain an increase in profits because it's a decrease in cost. Choice D, many small sugarcane growers joined together to form an association of sugarcane producers and began to buy supplies at low group rates. Lower supply cost is another type of cost decrease. It's not D. And then E, rainfall in sugarcane growing regions was higher than it had been during the previous year, allowing the growers to save money on expensive artificial irrigation. Save money is right in there in this one, so that's another cost decrease. So choice A, which basically says that there was a shift in the usage of the sugarcane of many countries, it's kind of a neutral thing. It doesn't explain why they would have, why profits would have gone up, and that makes choice A the correct answer for number 46. 499, question number 47. Which of the following most logically completes the argument below? So, okay, this is a complete the passage. We need to definitely track what role the blank has in the passage when we get to it. So Davison River farmers are currently deciding between planting winter wheat this fall or spring wheat next spring. Winter wheat and spring wheat are usually about equally profitable. Because of new government restrictions on the use of Davison River water for irrigation, per acre yields for winter wheat, though not for spring wheat, would be much lower than average. Therefore, we know we're headed into the conclusion here. Therefore, planting spring wheat will be more profitable than planting winter wheat since blank. So the conclusion is that planting spring wheat will be more profitable than planting winter wheat. So the blank is not the conclusion. What comes before the blank is the conclusion. Spring wheat will be more profitable, and since is going to be a reason. It's going to be either an explanation or potentially some additional evidence. Whatever it is, the correct answer choice will give us a reason that spring wheat would be more profitable than winter wheat, because it's in the same sentence where that conclusion happens. So we need spring wheat greater than winter in terms of profit. Okay, choice A. The smaller than average size of a winter wheat harvest this year would not be compensated for by higher winter wheat prices. So what that's saying is it only addresses winter wheat, and we were perhaps hoping for something that said spring is going to be better than winter. But what it's saying is that the limited yield per acre of winter wheat, so lower final amount of production, that's not going to be canceled out. The smaller production lot, will not be canceled out by higher prices. So that basically says, this year anyway, they are going to make less money on winter wheat than spring wheat, which is what we were hoping for. Or it's the reverse. We were hoping for spring is better than winter. Here, this says winter is less than spring, because it says normally they're about equally profitable. That's what it says in the passage. But choice A says the smaller yield will not be compensated by higher prices, so they will no longer be equally profitable. Choice A sounds great. Let's look at the other ones. Choice B, new crops of spring wheat must be planted earlier than the time at which standing crops of winter wheat are ready to be harvested. So what this is saying, basically, is that they can't do both. They're saying that winter wheat crops would still be up, out there in the fields, standing there being plants, and not ready to harvest at the time that you would be planting the spring wheat. But clearly, the passage is about deciding between spring or winter, not using both. So the fact that they can't do both at the same time doesn't matter. I mean, that's irrelevant. Choice C, the spring wheat that farmers in the Davison River region plant is well adapted to the soil of the region. That's great, but it doesn't actually say that the winter wheat is poorly adapted, and it also doesn't directly tie us to the notion of one being more profitable than the other, which is what the actual conclusion was. Spring wheat will be more profitable because the spring wheat is well adapted? No, that does not stand to reason. Choice D, spring wheat has uses that are different from those of winter wheat. Interesting. I had no idea. I don't even know if spring wheat and winter wheat are real things. It could just be made up for this question. In any case, outside the scope of the passage, having different uses, unless if this answer choice had talked about, or if the passage had talked about how different uses had different profit margins, like if because spring wheat is used for this other thing that makes more money, potentially this one could have been relevant, but we don't find anything out about that. It just says that they have different uses. So what? And then choice E, planting spring wheat is more profitable than planting certain other crops, such as rye. And this one started out so promising because, oh wow, planting spring wheat is more profitable. That's what we wanted to hear. Oh, but it's more profitable than planting other crops. We really, for this argument, the blank in the passage needed to be a support, a reason why spring wheat was more profitable than winter wheat, not why it's more profitable than other things. I guess the only way choice E could have been right is if it compared the profit of winter wheat to something like rye elsewhere. Then spring being better than rye would also mean that spring was better than winter. That didn't happen in this passage, so E is not going to happen as the correct answer. Ta-da! Choice A. Last one on page 499. Number 48. If the county continues to collect residential trash at current levels, landfills will soon be overflowing and parkland will need to be used in order to create more space. Charging each household a fee for each pound of trash it puts out for collection will induce residents to reduce the amount of trash they create. This charge will therefore protect the remaining county parkland. Which of the following is an assumption made in drawing the conclusion above? Okay, so the conclusion, and this is one of those ones that has kind of a shortcut, okay? When you're asked to identify the assumption in, and the conclusion is a prediction, or a plan, or a forecast, this thing is going to do this for us. We predict that by the year 2000 we will all have personal jetpacks or something like that. Obviously, it's too late for that. But so when the question is a prediction or a plan or a little bit of both, we want this plan because we predict it's going to do this other thing. Think of the first thing you should be thinking is that the central assumption will be something like the plan is actually going to work. Okay, and the assumption then in the correct answer choice will be that the correct answer choice will be that something that would make the plan not work is not going to happen, if that makes sense. Okay, so if my prediction is that I'm going to make it to the store by 3 p.m., my assumption is that, for example, there's not going to be a terrible snowstorm that shuts down all the roads and I can't get to the store. So, okay, shortcut then with forecasts and plans is that for assumption is that the assumption is it's going to work, and the correct answer would be a reason that it would potentially not work. They're assuming that that thing is not going to happen. Sorry for all the double negatives in the sentence. But hopefully that's clear. Okay, so an assumption made in the argument. Oh, and then we again, whenever there's a whenever the plan is, in order to determine which answer choice would undermine it, that they're assuming will not happen, you do need to have very clearly in mind what that goal or plan or prediction or forecast is. Okay, in this particular case, their prediction is that this fee, charging households a fee for trash, will protect the remaining county parkland. That's the last line of the passage. This charge will therefore protect the remaining county parkland. The right answer choice is they're assuming that there isn't going to be some other thing happening that would not protect the parkland. So A, are they assuming that residents will reduce the amount of trash they put out for collection by reducing the number of products they buy? No. I mean, that could be what happens, but the way that households will reduce their trash is not in question. To some extent, it doesn't sound like they care. They just want them to reduce their trash. This very specific way that they would reduce the amount of trash they produce, they being the households, is beyond the scope of the passage. Choice B, the collection fee will not significantly affect the purchasing power of most residents, even if their households do not reduce the amount of trash they put out. So this is kind of the money trap here. In evaluating the effectiveness of the plan and its impact on the community, a wise decision maker would consider whether it's going to negatively impact people economically, but that is outside the scope of the passage. We aren't actually worried about the cost. We're worried about whether it's going to protect the parkland. That's all we care about for this GMAT question. So again, this is often the challenge in critical reasoning. You know a lot of things about the real world, and that real world knowledge can pull you into directions that, again, if this were a real situation, if you were writing an essay for a class and they gave you something like this, what are all the factors you need to consider? A lot of GMAT wrong answer choices would be things you would want to have in your essay. In this particular case, though, we're just testing the logic here, and the logic is we need to protect the parkland. Choice C, the collection fee will not induce residents to dump their trash in the parklands illegally. Okay, so if the residents, if the households say, oh man, that fee is stupid, I don't want to pay that, and then they just dump their trash in the parklands, the plan is not successful. They have trash in the parklands, which is what they were trying to avoid. So choice C looks a lot like what we were hoping for, something they are assuming that, or among their assumptions could be that that this isn't going to cause things to happen to the parkland, because their goal is to protect the county parkland. Anyway, choice D, the beauty of county parkland is an important issue for most of the county's residents. That would be nice if it were true, but it's irrelevant to the issue of protecting the parkland via this fee. And then E, landfills outside the county's borders could be used as dumping sites for the county's trash. That could be true, again, but this is definitely a scope issue. Landfills outside the county are not really in question. The question is, will this fee protect the parkland? And this is not an assumption that's a key element in their argument or in their plan. So choice C, they are assuming that no one's going to go and dump trash in the parkland. And we get to turn the page to page 500. Moving right along. Question number 49. Okay. So, certain genetically modified strains of maize produce a powerful natural insecticide. The insecticide occurs throughout the plant, including its pollen. Maize pollen is dispersed by the wind and frequently blows onto milkweed plants that grow near maize fields. Caterpillars of monarch butterflies feed exclusively on milkweed leaves. When these caterpillars are fed milkweed leaves dusted with pollen from modified maize plants, they die. Therefore, by using genetically modified maize, farmers put monarch butterflies at risk. Which of the following would it be most useful to determine in order to evaluate the argument? First, summarize that argument. Modified maize hurts monarchs. So let's just say maize hurts monarchs, where by monarchs we mean the butterflies, not the rulers of countries. Okay, so maize hurts monarchs. And again, most useful to evaluate the argument. This actually kind of works like the one we just did. The correct answer, again, one of these, evaluate the argument. Oh, not the one we just did. The one before. The one, which one was that? Oh, I guess it was a little bit ago, actually. It was the first one we did today. Wow, time flies. Okay, so the first one we did today where we had to, which of the following would it be most useful to know to evaluate the plan? This is the same kind of thing. And the thing that it's useful to know is whether this other thing could weaken the argument, okay? And so we're going to look for something that says that maybe maize does not hurt the monarchs, okay? So it would be useful to know if there were some other factor that would make this conclusion untrue. Let's look for it. So choice A, would it be useful to know whether the natural insecticide is as effective against maize-eating insects as commercial insecticides typically used on maize are? So this is one of these false distinctions where whether it's as effective as synthetic insecticides or other ones that are applied from outside the plant, you know, whether one is more effective than the other is not the issue. The issue is we're simply asking whether the genetically modified maize hurts monarchs or not, whether it really actually hurts them. Because again, in the question stem, note that they actually fed these caterpillars these leaves, like in a lab. It doesn't say in a lab, but it says when these caterpillars are fed milkweed leaves, that means that somebody's feeding it to them. Here you go, little caterpillar, eat this leaf that might kill you, and then it kills them. We have to separate out what happens when this, you know, happens in the wild. And in fact, that's probably where the right answer is going to be. But let's see. Anyway, choice A, one insecticide being more effective than the other, not the right answer. Choice B, whether the pollen of genetically modified maize contains as much insecticide as other parts of these plants. Another one of these false distinctions. Who cares whether the one part has more than the other? The issue is whether the stuff that's in the pollen is going to kill the caterpillars. So, not B either. Choice C, whether monarch butterfly caterpillars are actively feeding during the part of the growing season when maize is releasing pollen. So in a lab, they give the little caterpillar a leaf with genetically modified maize, insecticide maize, on it, and it eats it and it dies. But it's useful to know whether the pollen is even going to be out on leaves when the caterpillars are actually eating those milkweed leaves. If it happens at different parts of the season, they're fine. I mean, they're not going to eat it because they're not going to be there. They'll be in butterfly form or something. So choice C actually sounds like something that would weaken the argument by saying they're actually at different times of the growing season. So we'll keep C. D, whether insects that feed on genetically modified maize plants are likely to be killed by insecticide from the plant's pollen. So this is basically saying, you know, does the insecticide that's in the maize kill the insects that eat maize directly? That would be very useful to know in deciding whether or not to use genetically modified maize or even to try to genetically modify maize, but it doesn't impact the monarch caterpillars. Choice E, whether any maize-eating insects compete with monarch caterpillars for the leaves of milkweed plants growing near maize fields. Competition of these maize-eating insects, you know, again, outside the scope of the argument. We only care about genetically modified maize, and we only care about how it affects the monarch butterflies. So choice C, whether they're actually eating the leaves when the pollen is on them, that's an important thing to know. Because if they don't, they won't die, at least not from that. So choice C. The milestone, page 500, question number 50. It's not really a milestone, it's just, you know, 50, 500 is 10 times 50, so it looks cool, I guess, to have that on the page. Okay, let's move on to the question. Although computers can enhance people's ability to communicate, computer games are a cause of underdeveloped communication skills in children. After school hours spent playing computer games are hours not spent talking with people. Therefore, children who spend all their spare time playing these games have less experience in interpersonal communication than other children have. The argument depends on which of the following assumptions. Okay, so this is one of those, evidence plus the assumption equals the conclusion. In this particular case, the conclusion is, all spare time spent with video games equals less, let's call it less social, but I mean communication skills there, okay? The evidence is that time spent playing video games is equals time not talking. So the assumption here then is that, well, it looks like the assumption would relate to what they're doing if they're not playing video games. So while it is true that time spent playing video games is typically time spent not talking, would it be true that if they spend all their time playing video games that they would be less social? Basically, the assumption is that if they are not playing video games, they are talking. Okay? So the assumption here is that no video games equals talking. Whereas, what if they are just reading a book instead of playing video games and not talking to people? So the assumption here is that they would be talking if they weren't playing games. Yes. So let's look for something like that in the answer choices. Choice A, passive activities such as watching television and listening to music do not hinder the development of communication skills in children. So this is one of these false distinctions, although it sounds kind of tempting based on what we were talking about, how they could be doing some other non-communicative activity. All choice A does is list a couple other activities that apparently do not hinder the development of communication skills in children. It still doesn't mean that they couldn't be doing something else that's not video games, that's also not talking, that also hurts their interpersonal communication skills. So choice A, it's one of those false distinctions. Choice B, most children have other opportunities in addition to after-school hours in which they can choose whether to play computer games or to interact with other people. So that's true. I would think, there's weekends and vacations and summer vacation and stuff like that. However, the scope, and this is one of these scope ones where really it helps to have clear in your mind what's actually going on. All this is about after school hours. That's actually what it says in, that's the second sentence. After school hours spent playing computer games are hours not spent talking with people. So the argument is only about what happens in after school hours. And that the argument is claiming that because some students some children are using all of their time playing video games, that's hurting their social skills. Okay, so C, children who do not spend all of their after school hours playing computer games spend at least some of that time talking with other people. So that actually does relate to the assumption that we had identified. Remember, we had said that they're assuming that if they aren't playing video games, they would be talking to people, in their argument saying that if you spend all your time playing video games, you're going to be less social. The assumption is that they are replacing talking time with video games. So they are assuming that children who are not playing video games all the time, that they're using some of that for talking to develop their interpersonal skills. They have to be assuming that, because otherwise their conclusion doesn't make sense. So choice E sounds really good. D, formal instruction contributes little or nothing to children's acquisition of communication skills, totally outside the scope. And then choice E, the mental skills developed through playing computer games do not contribute significantly to children's intellectual development, also outside the scope. So again, that leaves us with choice C, saying that they are assuming that the children who don't play video games all the time are talking to people. That's how they arrive at their conclusion that children who do spend all of their time playing video games are going to have less social skills. So choice C for number 50. Page 500, number 51. One variety of partially biodegradable plastic beverage container is manufactured from small bits of plastic bound together by a degradable bonding agent, such as cornstarch. Since only the bonding agent degrades, leaving the small bits of plastic, no less plastic refuse per container is produced when such containers are discarded than when comparable non-biodegradable containers are discarded. Which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument? The argument, we need to go to the actual conclusion. So the conclusion is the second half of the sentence that starts with since. Since is part of the evidence, but the conclusion is no less plastic in part biodegradable stuff. So their argument is that there's no less plastic in the partially biodegradable containers. Or no less plastic ends up in the landfill, basically. It doesn't actually mention landfills, but the end result, there's no less plastic with partially biodegradable versus non-partially biodegradable. So to strengthen that, we basically need to provide additional, the ways that you strengthen arguments, you either state the assumption, you turn the assumption is unstated evidence. You either state the assumption, which then makes it stated evidence, or you provide additional evidence to support your conclusion. Either way, the right answer will give us a reason why there's no less plastic in partially biodegradable stuff. Choice A, both partially biodegradable and non-biodegradable plastic beverage containers can be crushed completely flat by refuse compactors. Good to know, but we're not actually worried about the amount of space they take up. We're worried about the amount of plastic in the products, respectively. So how flat you can smush them doesn't matter. Choice B, the partially biodegradable plastic beverage containers are made with more plastic than comparable non-biodegradable ones in order to compensate for the weakening effect of the bonding agents. Okay, so choice B is saying they have to put a little bit more plastic in the partially biodegradable stuff to compensate for the weakness in the cornstarch, because by default, if you had two containers, one partially biodegradable, one not biodegradable at all, there would actually be slightly less plastic in a container of the same size, because all the parts where the bonding agent is in the partially biodegradable stuff, there's plastic there in the non-biodegradable one. So if they use slightly more plastic in the partially biodegradable one to compensate for the weakness, you're right back to having the same amount of plastic. And we needed to strengthen the idea that there is no less plastic in the partially biodegradable stuff. Choice B puts more plastic back in there, and that sounds like what we wanted. We wanted more plastic back in. I personally don't want more plastic back in there, but logically, to strengthen the argument, we need there to be the same amount of plastic, or at least the same amount. It could even be more. We just needed to strengthen the argument that there's not less. But let's keep reading the answer choices. Choice C, many consumers are ecology-minded and prefer to buy a product sold in the partially biodegradable plastic beverage containers rather than in non-biodegradable containers, even if the price is higher. That might be true, doesn't address plastic content though. So that's really kind of a scope thing. Choice D, the manufacturing process for the partially biodegradable plastic beverage containers results in less plastic waste than the manufacturing process for non-biodegradable plastic beverage containers. That's kind of a tongue twister, and I'm feeling pretty good about the fact that I keep saying non-biodegradable plastic beverage, stuff like that. Anyway, um, so the manufacturing process producing less waste. This is at first sounds like it's on topic because we're talking about amounts of plastic, but what we're actually after is the amount of plastic in the container itself. Manufacturing waste is not actually present in the container, and how they deal with that is actually outside the scope of the passage. This would still be an argument for manufacturers to choose to use non-biodegradable plastic beverage containers, but and so again, in the real world, it would be an important element of the decision, but for the purposes of the argument, we really only care about the amount of plastic in the containers themselves. So choice E, technological problems with recycling currently prevent the reuse as food or beverage containers of the plastic from either type of plastic beverage containers. So this is kind of a, after the fact, when we're recycling either biodegradable or non-biodegradable plastic beverage containers, that we can't necessarily use them again for food or beverage containers. Probably even true. I don't know that much about recycling, but that's far beyond the scope. All we care about is the amount of plastic. That's what the argument was about. So choice B, that partially biodegradable plastic beverage containers have to have slightly more plastic in them to make them as strong. Then they therefore have no less than their non-biodegradable counterparts. Choice B for number 51. And we have moved on to our final page of this broadcast, but we have a few more questions to go. Question number 52. Rye sown in the fall and plowed into the soil in early spring leaves a residue that is highly effective at controlling broad-leaved weeds, but unfortunately for only about 45 days. No major agricultural crop matures from seed in as little as 45 days. Synthetic herbicides, or herbicides, depending on where you grew up, on the other hand, although not any longer lasting, can be reapplied as the crop grows. Clearly, therefore, for major agricultural crops, plowing rye into the soil can play no part in effective weed control. The argument is most vulnerable to the objection that it fails to do what? Okay. And the argument, again, you always want to summarize the argument before you hit the answer choices to make sure you understood it. If you did not understand it, you probably should. No, I shouldn't be using weasel words like probably. If you get to the end and you didn't understand the argument and you get to the question and it says the argument is most vulnerable to the objection, you do need to go back and reread it. You won't be able to answer questions well at all. I mean, you might be able to eliminate some questions as outside the scope or some answers as outside the scope, but to get it right and not just guess, you do actually have to understand what's going on. And of course, if you've read the question first, you still need to pause to summarize the argument at the end before you hit the answer choices. Anyway, the argument is that plowing rye into the soil can play no part in effective weed control. And the reason is that it only lasts for 45 days and you can't reapply it. So potentially, it sounds like there's nothing that says you couldn't use rye for the first 45 days and then use insecticide later, perhaps. So let's look for something that says that rye could actually be a part of effective weed control, because that's what the objection would be. So A, does the argument fail to consider that there might be minor, quick-growing crops that do mature in 45 days or less? The argument does not fail to consider that, actually. It says no major agricultural crop matures from seed in as little as 45 days. They don't say that no plant does at all. There might be minor quick-growing crops, but the argument is about major agricultural crops. So the argument does not fail to consider minor crops. It's only talking about major ones. I think I just said the same thing twice. Anyway. Choice B, does it fail to identify any alternative method of weed control that could be used instead of the method it rejects? Well, no, I mean, it's rejecting rye, and it says that using synthetic herbicides could actually be fine. So it isn't failing to identify an alternative. So it's not B. Does it fail to distinguish among the various kinds of synthetic herbicides? It does not distinguish between them but the argument is not vulnerable to that objection. It doesn't really matter which one you use as long as any of them are better than rye, as far as the argument is concerned. So C is not it. D, does it fail to allow for the possibility of combining the two weed control methods it mentions? It does. So that was the thing I'd mentioned. You know, you could plow rye into the soil, and that would last for the first 45 days, and then once the plants are up and you can't plow more stuff in without ruining your crops, that's where these other chemicals could be applied. So it does fail to account for that. And choice E, does it fail to allow for the possibility that plants other than rye handled the same way might have the same effect? It doesn't, because it doesn't matter. Its point is that rye only lasts for 45 days and you can't keep reapplying it. So if there's another plant that works the same way, the argument would say that you can't use that either because it has the same problems that rye does. So choice D, it fails to account for the possibility that you could use both at the same time, because the argument is that rye plays no part when in fact potentially it could. Page 501, question number 53. Most employees in the computer industry move from company to company, changing jobs several times in their careers. However, Summit Computers is known throughout the industry for retaining its employees. Summit credits its success in retaining employees to its informal, non-hierarchical work environment. Which of the following, if true, most strongly supports Summit's explanation of its success in retaining employees? Summarize its explanation. Summarize Summit's explanation. To summarize it, the informal, non-hierarchical work environment is what makes people stay. So to support that argument, we need to basically say that again in the answer choice or provide additional evidence that the non-hierarchical informal work environment is awesome. Okay? So let's look for that in the answer choices. So strengthening questions are really that simple. You know, summarize the argument and then find the thing that either restates the assumption, or gives you additional evidence. The assumption here is that their explanation is actually true. Anyway, choice A, some people employed in the computer industry change jobs if they become bored with their current projects. Totally outside the scope. All we care about is Summit Computers' argument and their informal, non-hierarchical work environment. People being bored with projects is not in the scope. Choice B, a hierarchical work environment hinders the cooperative exchange of ideas that computer industry employees consider necessary for their work. So if hierarchical work environment hinders this thing that's considered necessary for your work, an informal non-hierarchical an informal non-hierarchical work environment would be considered good by employees, and so that would be that this supports the idea that it is the informal non-hierarchical work environment as opposed to the salary or the location that makes Summit Computers successful in retention. So choice B points us to the informal non-hierarchical work environment. Let's look to see if any of the other ones do. Choice C, many of Summit's senior employees had previously worked at only one other computer company. So this strengthens the idea that people stay there. And so if you weren't reading too carefully or mis-summarized what the argument was, you might choose this one because this does strengthen the claim that people stay there for a long time. We aren't strengthening the claim that people stay there a long time. We're strengthening the claim that it's because of the work environment. So choice C is not it. It strengthens the wrong thing. Choice D, in a non-hierarchical work environment, people avoid behavior that might threaten group harmony and thus avoid discussing with their colleagues any dissatisfaction they might have with their jobs. So this one sounds promising at first because it says that there's something about the non-hierarchical work environment. That's the sort of thing we want. But ultimately, all this says is that people just don't talk about it if they're unhappy. And if that's not the same thing as the success in retention being the non-hierarchical work environment. So it's not D. And then choice E, the cost of living near Summit is relatively low compared to areas in which some other computer companies are located. So there's the money trap, meant to attract you business minds out there. And in this case, it's way outside the scope of the passage too. I probably should have written it as scope. That would have been clever. Okay, anyway. So Right, so cost of living is not relevant to the question of whether it is, in fact, the informal, non-hierarchical work environment. It may be a factor in the real world, but all we were asked about is that particular aspect, so it's not E. It is, in fact, choice B, which says that other work environments restrict some things that some people consider important. Last one, page 501, number 54. This is a journalist talking. In late 1994, the present government of the Republic of Bellum came into power. Each year since then, about 30 journalists have been imprisoned for printing articles that criticize the government. In 1994, under the old government, only 6 journalists were imprisoned for criticizing the government. So the old government was more tolerant of criticism by the press than the new one is. Politician responds, but in 1994, only 6 journalists criticized the government, and now journalists routinely do. The politician challenges the journalist's argument by doing which of the following? So in some ways, this actually sounds like a quant question. There are those ones, especially in data sufficiency, where there's the difference between the real number and the ratio, or the percent. And so the journalist says, hey, in real numbers, the number of journalists imprisoned has gone up. And the politician says, well, in 1994, that was 100% of the journalists who criticized, and now it's no longer 100%. Journalists routinely criticize, so 30 per year maybe isn't as much. So that's something about how the politician responds. We need something like that from the answer choice, that the politician, I don't know, gives additional, puts the information into a different perspective maybe. Okay, so choice A is the politician presenting data that extends further into the past than the journalist's data. No. Well, I mean, I guess it's true that the politician says in 1994 and the journalist says in late 1994, but that's not really further into the past. They're both in 1994, so it's not A. Is the politician introducing evidence that undermines an assumption of the journalist's argument? Well, this sounds kind of tempting because it is new evidence. It's, saying, hey, in the past it was 100% of the journalists who were imprisoned, and it does kind of undermine the assumption that the journalist's assumption is that the 30 journalists per year is an increase in the rate of imprisonment, and the politician's evidence kind of undermines that, saying it's not an increase in the rate, it's just an increase in the real number, and maybe a decrease in the rate. So is the politician questioning the accuracy of the evidence presented in support of the journalist's conclusion? No, the politician doesn't say that's not true. In fact, the politician is relying on the journalist's facts also being true, so it's not undermining the accuracy. Is the politician pointing out that the argument illegitimately draws a general conclusion on the basis of a sample of only a few cases? No, I mean, in fact, it's not only a few cases, it's each year since late 1994, which, granted this is an old question, but, that's been a while. It's not a small sample, a sample of only a few cases. In choice E is the politician stating that the argument treats information about some members of a group as if it applied to all members of the group. No, we don't find a distinction between different types of journalists, so it's not E, which brings us back to B, introducing evidence that undermines an assumption of the journalist's argument. Again, the journalist is assuming that the increase in number imprisoned is an increase in rate of imprisonment, and the politician is saying that no, it went from 100% imprisonment rate to something lower than 100%. So that is undermining what the journalist says with new information. Answer choice B is our correct one. So the clock on the wall says that's all for the GMAT OG TV program for today. Next time we'll pick up on page 502 with question number 55. Have your official guide at hand for when we talk about it. My name's Jim Jacobson, and you've been watching Grockit.com OG TV. Hope to see you next time.